Our last speaker for today is Emma Domingo, and she has been at PEP since Core C. In the fall, she will be attending Jacksonville University to study nursing. Emma has been a swimmer for 13 years and felt very strongly about the issue last year with the transgender athletes competing in college athletics. Her thesis is Who Makes the Rules? Transgender Athletes in Sports.
Picture this. Music silently blaring through your headphones. A soft, warm parka keeping the nervous goosebumps to a minimum. Tight, tinted goggles acting as built-in blinders for the hundreds of people in the stands. Ready behind the starting block, only hoping that you're about to dive in and go half as fast as your heart is racing. Ready to race no differently than the hundreds of meets before. Except this time, it is different. There's someone new, someone unheard of, someone distinct, someone who towers almost a foot taller over you and your other competitors. As you dive in, after the quick moment of stillness, following the usual take your mark, an eruption comes along. Someone screaming cheater roars in the distance, right as you pierce the water's still surface with your hands. After what feels like the longest 4 minutes and 40 seconds of your life, you exit the pool. You're watching your close friend, an Olympic silver medalist, stand second on the podium to a transgender female whose name was not relevant until this very moment in time. The tears, the shock, and the empathy for your hardworking friend whose NCAA title was taken by someone of the opposite sex. These are the exact thoughts and events that went through 3-time All-American Kinsey McMahon's head while she raced transgender swimmer Leah Thomas in the 500-yard freestyle at the 2022 NCAA Championships. The term transgender is a fairly new phenomenon, but before I formally define it, let's start with the 2 definitions that go hand in hand with it: sex and gender. According to the Yale School of Medicine, sex is used as a classification, generally male or female, according to the reproductive organs and functions that derive from the chromosomal complement, generally XX for female and XY for male. Essentially, our born, God-given identity. While gender is defined and used to refer to a person's self-representation as male or female, or how that person is responded to by the social institutions on the basis of the individual's gender presentation. Essentially, our chosen identity, or our internal sense of who we think we should be and how we want the world to view us. People often ask, well, which one do I identify myself as? Which is my true identity? I will be addressing many questions like these in the rest of my speech. So, now that gender and sex are clear, the term transgender can come into the picture. According to Mayo Clinic's definition of transgender, it's those whose gender identity differs from the sex assigned at birth. They are individuals who are unsatisfied with the sex that God designed them to be, therefore actively taking steps, physically, socially, and to become the opposite gender and hope to become satisfied with their new and improved identity. For example, someone born with the male reproductive parts, classified as a male since birth, one day in the future decides that they want to become a female, seeking to be satisfied by the world and people's acceptance. The perfect example of this is transgender swimmer Leah Thomas, whom I mentioned earlier. Society is not only encouraging this behavior, but going as far to place God-given sex next to self-determined gender, when this is not how God intended our world to be. As of 2022, according to the UCLA Williams Institute, 1.6 million adults and children are transgender. That is 0.5% of adults and 1.4% of children ranging from the ages 13 to 17. Attempting to navigate who they truly are in a world where gender-based stereotypes and societal pressure is constantly amongst them. Society and large platforms are fueling the fire and placing a spotlight on transgender individuals, causing uproar and strife amongst people. While it is no surprise that this is becoming more prevalent amongst individuals experiencing identity crisis, It is not something that we should simply just brush off. The pre-existing worldviews and political opinion, whether they are biblical or secular, shape a person's view, oftentimes leading them blindly to exclude the fundamental biological facts of humanity that were set long ago. Merriam-Webster defines a sport as a particular activity, such as an athletic game so engaged in. It is simply a physical game that results in building healthy competition and good exercise. This does not have to do with politics. Many people disagree with this, making the problem much larger than it should be. This is a worldly dilemma that is clearly and directly a result of mankind themselves, due to lack of knowledge, denial of basic truths, and a sin-filled world. As a result of transgenderism in society, its detrimental effects are first-handedly shown in the sports world. The question of whether trans athletes should compete amongst their current gender or use their pre-puberty gender identification to compete is something that is becoming much more relevant. Sex and gender are becoming relative truths in our world, which makes any action or step towards a universal solution more difficult as more time goes on. We ask ourselves questions like, is equality and inclusion amongst all genders needed? Is exclusion needed to keep the peace? Questions that have never been asked before are coming to the surface in an attempt to solve this universal dilemma. Jennifer McCarthy, a gender scientist who defends biological females, wanted to defend a potential bill and define sex solely as a person's reproductive genetics and biology at birth. This seems like common sense and knowledge, but is not anymore. Biological sex has always been what sports are based on, but now gender is becoming the basis. Even the International Olympic Committee's definition for gender states people's inner sense of their gender, which may or may not correspond with the sex that they were assigned with at birth. How are the foundation of sports going to stand with these new identity definitions entering the world? The biological foundation of what makes up a human is slowly being stripped away, even by extremely influential platforms. One way to overcome this division is to remind all people where the ultimate truth lies, which is in Scripture. In Mark, we are instructed to love our neighbor as ourselves. In Genesis, in the garden, we are created male and female in his image. Lastly, in Jeremiah, where he reminds us that we were knit together in our mother's womb for a purpose, with a predestined plan set for our lives. By applying these basic truths, along with evidence and biological factors, there can be a solution to transgender individuals competing in sports. We can be set free from the deceitfulness of sin entering our world through the differing opinions. In this speech, the main idea of my arguments, I will be addressing the issue in why transgender individuals should not compete against biological males and females, solely in the realm of the sporting world. I will not be including topics like intersex, bisexual, or other potential gender differences. I will cover why there should be an added open category to eliminate overall discrimination and promote fairness through logical inclusion with transgender athletes. My biblically founded beliefs and opinions and scientific evidence will point to the fact that God created us the sex he intended at birth. With that being said, my thesis statement will explain that by finding truth and letting transgender individuals compete in sports through a compromise will slow the rage of the nation, promote inclusion in a logical sense, and ultimately bring peace. Now we will look into some ways that we can bring these truths to life, starting with fairness in sports being the most important part of the game. It seems like a given, but is often forgotten within society. Rules in sports are not to eliminate or exclude, or even complicate. They exist to keep order, to allow healthy competition, and keep a level playing field. People are basing fairness on their own biased views and opinions, when really, rules and parameters are relative to the specific situation. Lauren Bialystock wrote, for the social theory and practice, that rules only make sense in the context of competition. When people don't take time to inform themselves of the context of the specific sport or environment, they are left ignorant, and their pre-existing worldviews blind them from understanding why the rules are enforced, making it harder to have one universal rule respected and appreciated. And this is repeatedly shown in the sports world. where some rules are universal, yes, but when it comes to sports, they're more specific due to the differences and complexity in each one. Rules are different from situation to situation, sport to sport, and ultimately male to female. Hopefully you can see my emphasis on fair play here, because fair play and rules involving inclusion in sports teach people universal good values. Inclusion used in the correct terms can be very beneficial and is important to keep all aspects and values of the sport balanced. One of the most important things to consider is when the evidence supports inclusion and when it should properly promote exclusion in a respectful way. With that being said, complete inclusion of all sports does not mean that fairness is being achieved. All sports are different and all methods of inclusion and fair play will be different. According to the IOC policy, it is up to the governing body of each sport to determine how an athlete may be at disproportionate advantage against their peers, taking in consideration the nature of each sport. If all sports and rules were equal, especially regarding transgender competition, it would eliminate the overall purpose of having different sports categories and guidelines for each one in the first place, taking away the uniqueness of each sport, leaving nothing to be left. The IOC and the NCAA and the World Athletic Council and all large organizations seek inclusion, but are aware of the detrimental effects that it can have if used incorrectly. John Long wrote in Swimming World that it is critical that the transgender athletes find a welcoming environment in our sport, but that cannot happen without first guaranteeing the fairness for biological women. Brooks then says that we want to look at science-based policies that protect the safety and fairness in sports, but also find a way to include participation. Biological evidence is one way that we can deductively and respectively deny inclusion in a logical sense, while upholding biblically founded inclusion beliefs and properly taking in consideration everyone, but not everyone at the same time. The problem is what seems fair to one group is not always fair, is not going to be fair to the other. In an attempt to make one group happy, the other becomes unheard, unseen, and rejected. Top collegiate athletes and NCAA championship titleists Riley Gaines and Kinsey McMahon testified to this. The feeling of ignorance and exclusion regarding their consent for a biological male to compete against them in the most important race of their collegiate career. This not only disrespects them as swimmers, but also as women, who earn the right to compete separately from men 50 years from 2022. According to the Women's Sports Foundation, before the Title IX laws were passed, only 15% of women competed in college athletics. Now that number has risen drastically to 44%, allowing women to have more opportunities in competing in more types of sports, just as men do. In 2022, the celebration of the 50 years of these laws began, coincidentally, the same year that transgender swimmer Leah Thomas was able to compete. These Title IX laws have been shifted away from the focus of women to the overall gender acceptance and discrimination dilemma at hand. I had the privilege to speak with Kinsey McMahon, a very decorated and accomplished swimmer, whom I mentioned at the beginning, a swimmer for University of Alabama from Jacksonville, who coincidentally raced Thomas side by side in the 500 free at the NCAAs. Now to this year, she just won the national title in the 500-yard freestyle, the same event that Thomas won the year prior. She talked about how everyone at the championship celebrated the anniversary of these Title IX laws in 2022, and she says that it was extremely ironic for people to be celebrating in such a time. T-shirts were being handed out claiming and celebrating women's ability and right to compete in sports, when later that very day, Thomas took home a title in the 500-yard freestyle and became a 3-time All-American female. Now, let's take it back to biology. The basic biology behind it all continues to repeatedly prove and support the reasoning and need for creating an extra category for transgender individuals. As truth becomes relative to one's beliefs and concrete facts uncovered by biologists, scientists, and biblical findings, and even ancient rules are being questioned and denied, though we know they are the absolute truth. So in this day and age, how are we able to know the absolute truth? Well, from as early as Genesis chapter 1, we have identified ourselves into those two categories, set for us by the Creator: male and female. Everyone comes into this world with one of the two sexes. At least, that's what it says in our birth certificate, which doctors are the ones determining. God created specific biological differences for the roles that we have. One obvious example given by our very own science teacher, Miss Hollis, says that women as the birth givers possess wider hips, which makes them more injury prone due to the muscle arrangements down the leg, which imposes more implications for high intensity and even low intensity sports. This is also related to the difference in levels in body fat. We are all hopefully aware and familiar with man's ability to gain muscle faster due to less fat, which is why after a few days of going to the gym as an average athletic teenage boy, they can bench a plate, while for women, it can take more than double the time it took for a teenage boy to. This may not be every single female, but definitely speaks for most. The National Health Institute says that the difference in average body fat between male and woman is roughly a whole 10%. God did not do this by mistake. Therefore, transgender individuals identifying as the opposite gender does not make them equal to the opposite sex. The Journal of Sex Research explains how gender-affirming surgery and hormone therapy are biological approaches to change one's sex. Hormone therapy is the use of male and female hormones to suppress or enhance the ones that are needed. For a female transitioning to a male, they receive specific amounts of testosterone, and for males to become more feminine, they receive testosterone blockers, like estrogen, the female hormone. Transgender swimmers like Thomas are the perfect examples of this. Mayo Clinic says that hormone therapy helps better align the body with a person's gender identity, but this is not completely changing their sex. Therefore, even if they identify as the other gender, their sex and their reproductive biology from birth still remains the same. Now, onto gender-affirming surgery, or GAS. While this is more extreme and more permanent of an outcome, it alters more than just hormone levels and slight outside appearance. It replaces the current reproductive parts with ones of the opposite desired sex. Quite the process that God did not intend for us to go through. Now, even with this, it is done to convince people that they have not only completely switched their gender, but also switched their sex, when really, their chromosomal makeup still remains the same. The Sports Science Institute says that transgender individuals need to be on hormone therapy for a year or more and supply testosterone levels at the start of the season and then again 6 months later to make sure that they maintain them, or they do not go above or below the specific standard. Leah Thomas did this exactly as said, following the guidelines, but she was also 6'4". Here we can see Thomas standing next to a male coach, having already gone through male puberty, possessing longer limbs, a wider frame, and most definitely better lung capacity, along with a lifetime of male training. Yes, despite the hormonal treatment resulting in less muscle mass than before, less testosterone, and other male hormones, Thomas still has characteristics that a biological woman will never be able to possess. Lung capacity is very important in almost all sports, especially swimming, in terms of endurance and recovery. While most of you who have taken biology with either Ms. Kassebaum or Ms. Hollis, you have participated in the respiratory unit lab. This is where two people blow one breath into a long plastic bag, measuring your total lung capacity, and of course, after comparing it to your friends. Most of the time, the boys possess more air in their bag, whether the girls like it or not. Personally, I was definitely a little upset. But I had to continue to remind myself that this is how God designed us to be. He did not do this by mistake. Now, taking it back to the sporting world, biological women cannot compete against such an advantage. Here, I'm going to show you a clip of my close friends and teammates, Aubrey and Ralphie, whom I've trained with for quite a while. These swimmers are extremely identical in various areas, even placing themselves in the same percentile in height and weight, both being shorter than the average swimmer. Here is a simple start off the block. Aubrey on the left, next to the wall, and Ralphie on the right in lane 2. This is demonstrating the difference in strength and reaction time. Reaction time is very important for a swimmer, especially in the shorter races that can sometimes take as little as 18 seconds. It can make or break a race. These swimmers also maintain the same diet, practices, intervals, rest days, and strength training routine for more than 5 years, all relative to the different male and female standards for strength and food intake, of course, but identical in proportion to their bodies. Both going on in college to swim at the D1 level, they do not have the same times, but they rank in the same place in their respective categories. Putting equal work but getting different outcomes should be no surprise. We can clearly see that from the very start of the race that there was an advantage. The mobility, strength, and the explosiveness off the block is only the beginning of the external obvious advantage that will only continue throughout the rest of the entire race. Now, switching gears into the more biblical aspect at hand. While we agree that as Christians we are made in the image of God, as the gender He created us at birth, others may take biblical evidence out of context, believing that we should be able to choose who we want to become, and the Bible promotes inclusion of all genders. Galatians 3:28, in Paul's letters written to the early church, he addresses this issue of inclusion and acceptance of all God's people in society, saying that there is no longer Greek nor Jew, there is no longer slave nor free, there is no longer male nor female. We are all, for all of you are one in Christ Jesus. This verse to many people who may not know or understand the truth spoken in the Old Testament can come across in a way supporting transgender or other unfair equality movements, saying that Jesus himself wanted to eradicate the differences and support the free choice of gender, race, and even religion. When the true intention of this verse was to explain that as Christians walking together in a community, they have the power and knowledge and truth to believe that we are set free from the strongholds of a demeaning power culture that makes one feel alone, unworthy, or different regarding how they stand in their beliefs. Because we know that everyone's identity in Christ and the things of this world do not define us as individuals. The brutal gender-conforming stereotypes and attacks do not stand against our God-given identity. So now that we have explored the biological, societal, and organizational complex backgrounds regarding the issue of transgender athletes competing in sports, there has been much to take into consideration, starting with better understanding the basic foundations of fairness from both sides of the argument, better understanding how we can uncover and recognize the illogical approach the public has taken for this new issue that has an old solution. We have examined the biological evidence that supports the significant differences that God placed in male and female bodies. This was no accident, because for the purpose of creation and their different roles. After hearing from first-hand witnesses of the direct competitors affected by these unfair guidelines, people are blindly following, which portrayed the detrimental unrest and hurt that biological males and females are experiencing. Finally, concluding that we are a broken, sinful world with much to change. But if we work together, not by a degrading comparison through differing opinions, there can be an ultimate peace, only granted by knowing that the true Creator can save us. And finally, transgender athletes should one day possess their own category so that they too can advance their athletic career without all of the dramatic underlying effects of the enemy. So now let's take it back to the start. We are probably still wondering, who does make the rules? And I hope now you may have a better grasp of that answer. Well, yes, I did mention the IOC, the World Athletic Council, and the NCAA many times. These are not whom I am speaking of. I am talking about the ones whose guidelines triumphed over all evil and confusion in this world. The one who created male and female in his image with a purpose and a plan. The one who loves each of us endlessly and wants to include all of us through love and through his commands. Because one day we will join him in heaven with no exclusion, no unworthiness, and no suffering. He appoints our leaders and knows each and every step towards the future. So there's no need to fear or go astray from his path. So if you only take one thing away from my speech, I hope you remember that the King of Kings, the Creator, and the Almighty God is the one who makes the rules, given to us as Christians to follow, share, and exemplify through his mighty word. Thank you. Okay. Any questions? You.
So, how do you believe Christians are to behave towards transgender people? Are they to obey God's command to love all the people with open arms, or to obey His commandment to just stay where we are as male and female, and just not be such a at all? You don't have to answer that question if you don't want to.
Okay, so the question is, how are we as Christians supposed to act towards those who are transgender? Are we supposed to accept them with open arms or disregard them? If that's your question. Okay, so I think as Christians, we are definitely supposed to, like, as I said at the beginning, like, love our neighbor as ourselves. We're supposed to, not in terms of, like, the sporting world, we're supposed to just, like, love them how they can and show them, like, maybe lay out the foundations of Christianity a little bit and just show them what our true identity is and kind of just explain that to them. And if they don't take it, then just continue to love them and pray for them, I would say. But I don't think that we should, like, disregard them. I think we should continue to pray for them. And yes, does that kind of answer your question? Yes. Okay.
Thank you.
Paul.
What about Deuteronomy 22:5, which says that that men who wear women's clothing and women who wear men's clothing are to be considered utter abominations and fearfuls?
So the question is, can you say the question?
So, how would you react then to 22:5, Deuteronomy 22:5, which says that men who wear women's clothing and women who wear men's clothing are abominations, should be repulsed?
So the question is, how should I react, or what is my opinion on Deuteronomy 22:5? Yes, basically. Well, my topic, as I said at the beginning, was about transgenderism, like in sports specifically, and not really the topic of transgenderism itself. So that's kind of outside the scope of my research. But I would say that, I mean, we are called to love them, and all we can do is love them here. But yeah, that answers your question, kind of.
I have a question.
Yes.
What can we do to support women in sports?
Okay, the question is, what can we do to support women in sports? I think to support women in sports, we can make sure that their opinions are heard, because as I talked about, Riley Gaines and Kinsey McMahon, and all of the other, like, collegiate swimmers, since they were never asked their opinion for the transgender individuals to compete, like, that resulted in them feeling unheard, like, unseen and rejected. So I think just getting their opinions, and even if their opinions are, no, they shouldn't compete, just getting their opinions at all is definitely something that's, like, valuable to an athlete, especially an athlete at such a high level, if that answers your question.
Yes, thank you.
Any more? Okay.